Welcome to Mental Health Matters, a community approach to overcoming the childhood mental health crisis. My name is Dr. Shaylin Soma, and I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at Star Commonwealth. Here at Star, we have spent over a century on what is now a national emergency, the mental health of children and adolescents. We are so proud to dedicate our 110th year to generate awareness and have conversations with community partners as we work together to solve this important issue. Today's session in our Mental Health Matters series is called Every Second Counts: Strategies to Strengthen Connection During Early Childhood Development. In this discussion, we are going to focus on the youngest population being impacted by the mental health emergency among children and adolescents, our infants, our toddlers, and our preschool-age children. Brain research supports the fact that in early childhood, children are actually building over 1 million brain connections every second. The framework these brain connections form within a child's mind drive the way they experience, the way they understand, and the way they interact with the world. Since the groundbreaking Center for Disease Control Kaiser ACEs study in the mid-1990s, we now know that these experiences shape not just their emotional health, but also their physical health. Ensuring that we are building a strong foundation for children to learn and grow is paramount to not just their own health and wellness, but also their families, their communities, and future generations. As we collectively assess the post-pandemic world, there is one of many things that has become clear. We need greater investment in early childhood care and education, and it's going to take a village. In this session, our panelists will share their first-hand experiences creating learning spaces and providing opportunities that strengthen the brain framework and ultimately the behaviors, the emotions, and the educational outcomes of children. They will share their lessons learned from the field and provide recommendations to implement your own early childhood strategies and share hope through the many success stories of the children that they serve. I'd like to give a special thank you to our sponsor, Sturgis Bank, for their financial support for this session. And also our partner, Port Huron Schools Early Childhood Center and St. Clair RESA, for not only the amazing trauma-informed, resilience-focused care that they provide their students, but also the key role they played in helping us develop our early childhood curriculum and resources. And I'd also like to say thanks to our studio audience joining us on our historic Albion, Michigan campus, as well as a thank you to all of you for joining us online. We're honored to have you with us. And with that, I'm excited to kick off our panel discussion. It's great to be joined by this amazing group of professionals. Let's get to know each of them with a quick round of introductions. Could each of you just briefly introduce yourselves, stating your name and your title?
I'm Angie Tucker. I'm an occupational therapist and I work for Early On.
I'm Tracy Blake. I'm a special education teacher consultant, and I also work for Early On at St. Clair RESA.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jennifer Brookland. I cover child well-being for the Detroit Free Press, and I'm a core member with Report for America, which sends journalists to cover underreported topics around the country.
Excellent, thank you.
I'm Joe Zima, behavior specialist at St. Clair County RESA, clinical social worker and adjunct professor with Western Michigan University in the social work department.
Oh my goodness, wonderful. Thank you again to all of you for being part of this really, really important conversation. So where should we get started? Let's start with you, Jennifer. I would just love for you to tell us what sparked your interest in the recent article that you wrote for the Detroit Free Press.
Earlier in the middle of March, there was an Early Childhood Capital Day. So parents, advocates, industry professionals, childcare providers were all going to go to Lansing and advocate and sort of share their lived experience, their policy recommendations, so that lawmakers could put a focus on those early childhood years. And I have no idea what they discussed there because I had to drop my kids off and I couldn't go. But I thought, all right, I will log on and see, at least I'll try to tune in and see what people are saying. And one of the first things I noticed pop up in just the chat on Facebook was two childcare providers who said, well, what are we going to do about the mental health issues that are facing our kids? And I was really, honestly, confused because I was like, I thought we were talking about young kids. They don't have mental health, do they? They don't need mental health interventions, right? That's for older people and
Aren't
adults.
they too little to know what's going on?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it really kind of surprised me, and I wanted to learn more about that. And then as a parent, I just thought, have I been overlooking? You know, I have little kids too, and
How
I'm
old are
thinking
your kids?
I have almost 3, 5, and 8.
Oh, okay.
So I was thinking, is this something as a parent I need to be focused on in a way that I've just chalked all this up to them being little, you know, or them not being able to express themselves or them getting frustrated? You know, as a parent, do I need to look at this from a mental health perspective?
So just the very fact that mental health can impact children that are that young, right? And in the introduction, we talked about every second 1 million brain pathways are created depending upon the experience that child is having. So what did you learn as you started to investigate more and learn more?
Yeah, I learned that mental health issues among our youngest kids pre-existed the pandemic. I mean, a lot of these childcare providers I was speaking with were talking about the effect of COVID and the changes that they were seeing post-COVID. But what they also told me was that this was not something that was created by the pandemic. I mean, young children have had emotional, mental health issues and emotional struggles, well preceding the pandemic. But what I also
Brought to light.
right, but they've been exacerbated by the pandemic, coupled with the fact that their providers are under stress, their parents are under stress. So it's kind of a perfect storm of factors playing into the a sort of acute environment where these kids are struggling, and they don't have the support that they need. Their parents don't have the support they need. Their childcare providers don't have what they need to address it.
So when it comes to mental health in early childhood, how do we know that a child may be having a mental health concern or something that's impacting their mental health? Because certainly at 0, birth to 18 months, there are no words to describe what's happening in that person's being. Mm-hmm. So what do we see?
I think this is probably a question more for the rest of the panel, but what the experts told me when I asked this question was, because I was saying, how can you tell if it's just a kid being too little to communicate, or maybe a developmental delay? How do you know that it's a mental health issue? And what I'd love to hear what you all have to say about this, but what I heard was that it's the intensity of that frustration or the aggression, the inability to focus, or the frequency. So the intensity and the frequency were the two sort of things that can differentiate mental health struggles from some of those other things. And then, of course, some behaviors just go beyond the normal developmental issues, any kind of self-harm, and some of the regressions, but I think the experts can weigh in better than I can on that.
Yeah, so in the article, Jen, you talked a lot about just the emotional outbursts, the behavior challenges that professionals are seeing. Is that what you're also seeing in the schools and in early on?
I think just to kind of piggyback on what Jen was saying, what really led us into looking more deeply into how stress impacts behavior, what is trauma. We're several years before the pandemic, where part of what we do at St. Clair County RESA and the behavior referral system is created a countywide referral system. So when schools were working with kids that kind of exceeded their capacity to meet those challenges in the local school, they could contact RESA, and as individuals that have experience with some of the toughest kids across the state, we could help intervene. And kind of to piggyback on what you had said, was we were seeing an increase in intensity, frequency, duration of some of these behavioral healthcare symptoms that we see compared to the students' peers or colleagues, if you will. So we're seeing an increase in really reactive, aggressive behaviors. Kids as young as kindergarten throwing chairs at their teachers, storming out of the building, crying, refusing to go to class. Things that Up until 5, 6, 7 years ago, we're kind of limited to experience we would have in a residential healthcare setting.
Sure.
And all of a sudden, we were seeing 1 or 2 kids across the county with some of these behavioral health symptoms. And now fast forward kind of through the pandemic, where I believe things were exacerbated prior to the pandemic. But now we see several kids in each of our 7 school districts, at least in St. Clair County, that are displaying some of these symptoms. So it seems to be increasing, but what we're seeing is just what Jen said, just an increase in intensity, frequency of these symptoms.
So Tracy and Angie, in the early on setting, you're really going into homes and you're really able to see the behaviors that are showing up in the infants, toddlers, and then, of course, the preschool age children. What are some of the things that you're seeing?
So I think, our families are feeling very concerned. They're afraid to take their kids out into public because they're afraid that they're not going to be able to, control them. Kids are feeling, I think, I feel like kids are unsettled in themselves, and then parents are unsettled. And I think that a lot of it is that self-regulation. They don't know how to soothe themselves, comfort themselves, and then parents don't know how to comfort them. So they're actually staying in and not going out, which I think is probably like a vicious cycle because they're not getting opportunities for social interaction. And I think, there is a little bit of a delay sometimes in that speech. So I think that can add to frustration. And I think, our communities are under such stress. Our parents are under such stress, which has exacerbated since COVID, job changes, working from home. So I think that, it's kind of this vicious cycle that is showing up in our little ones.
And I think what a lot of adults and professionals forget is that we expect children to just be regulated because we ask them to be regulated, or we want them to follow a rule or a social norm, let's say in the grocery store or wherever we might be out to dinner. And we forget that they require us to help them regulate, right? So if the adults in the settings aren't regulated and they've got all this external stress, how does that compound on top of the child's experience?
Yeah, that lack of that inconsistency. Life's not the same as it was before. They're unsure. They maybe don't, things are a little bit different than they were, and they might lose that sense of trust or connection with that adult. So, yeah.
What stands out to you, Tracy? What are you seeing?
At the center, as the administrator of that center, I did see, there were always behaviors, as Joe said. We always had little ones with behaviors, but when we returned from the pandemic, there was an increase in aggression, an increase in those challenging behaviors. We also saw an increase in elopement. Children were not only leaving the classrooms, but we had children leaving the building. So, that was something that was a huge concern for us. Sure. They become frustrated and they run out the classroom door and they're running down the hall. And some children were running out the door of the building, which and we were safety hazards. So, that was the biggest concern, the thing that we noticed more of upon returning. But I also saw from that administrative point that my staff were coming back different. They were more overwhelmed, more questions. Maybe people that never asked questions before were asking me a lot of questions. We had a lot of just, can you come help me? A lot more of that need to come and support them in the classroom. So I really saw both sets of needs, and we were going to have to address those.
So you're seeing dysregulated children, some dysregulation in the adults caring for the children, and then you as professionals and parents, right, saying, oh my goodness, I have to help regulate these adults so that the children can be regulated, right? So it's really just so interconnected. Wow, okay. So what do you do when you go into, let's say, a house or a classroom and you're seeing this frustration that a parent or an educator has with these behaviors that are seemingly just so out of control and they don't know what to do? Where do you even start?
I think personally, I do start with the parent. I have to help them feel calm and assured and educate them, empower them, just to really help them gain that confidence. And I really try to teach the parent about themselves, how they're feeling, and then try to relate that to how their child is feeling. That's just how I am as a learner. Like, I feel like if I can feel something for myself, then I'm able to relate that. So I'm trying to help them understand that how stress impacts them, that their child will feel that, as well as how they're feeling is going to impact that. So I'm just trying to really help teach the parents about even just regulation and what their bodies are feeling.
And the same thing in the center with staff. I think of that twofold. And what I'm hearing you say is what I was feeling as the administrator. Those staff members had to feel empowered. They needed to know that they could take care of and do what they needed to do each day. So I kind of gave them every week, maybe a list of priorities. We all know we had to write our lesson plans, and we all know we have to follow policies and procedures. But my biggest kind of tip for them each week was, number one, our goal is to make sure children are safe. Yeah. But number two, to make sure each child feels loved and cared for. So when you leave at the end of the day, if you've done those two things, then you have been successful today, because the rest will fall in place.
So it's almost like what I'm hearing is the social emotional piece is coming first. They have to feel loved and cared for and safe, right? Those universal needs at the bottom in order to even be able to be in the classroom to thrive. So, okay, I have so many questions. One question that's coming up for Jen specifically is, I think in your article you uncovered the frustration of child caring professionals in just having access to the resources or the training that they need to be able to know that the social emotional needs come first, or know what those practical things that they can do in the classroom are. Can you speak to that a little bit of what people were saying?
I think there is a lot of frustration, as you're mentioning, among childcare providers that, historically, they've not been viewed as a very professional profession. And I think there's still a lot of sort of indignation, that they are still perceived as basically glorified babysitters when they do so much.
And here, their role is creating the foundation for the rest of this child's life and ability to know how to regulate. Absolutely. Right? So we could argue that they're the most important person, or they have the most important role in that child's life.
Yeah. They felt very overlooked, especially just in this whole context of very low wages, a lack of, I would say, state support. The state, for example, raised the child care subsidy rate that they pay to child care providers, but it's set to decrease again in the fall. And so a lot of child care providers just felt so unseen and unheard. So I think in the context of, trying to provide mental health and be that loving, consistent presence in a kid's life, they just don't feel like, it's a lot to ask, and it's a lot to ask of a person who is not feeling, at top mental health themselves. So to also feel so undervalued, it just creates a bit of a toxic environment for a lot of them.
So that might be our first take home, right? Our key takeaway is that we need to make sure that child caring professionals are feeling valued. And, to go back to the title of what today's series is all about, is that every second counts, right? In your every interaction with these children is so very important. So we have to see that value.
And that's a lot of, it's a lot of pressure in a way to think that, gosh, I have to be on every second. All these billions of neural pathways are decided based on what I do right now. It's a lot of pressure, but I would say it's also such an opportunity, because really the most important thing, as we've all been pointing out, is just to be there and try to stay calm and provide that loving, consistent presence is the most important thing that these people can do. And they don't necessarily have to have, I'm sure they'd all like to have more training, more funds, less staff turnover, higher wages. But really, if they can just try to be there for those kids and show up for them, that can overcome a lot of other barriers.
So what are some of the kind of the smaller practical things that we can be doing in these moment-to-moment interactions with children? I guess any of you, if you want to share, what's kind of your go-to? I know you said we start with the parent, and you start with the parent, and what might be like, hey, if you can do anything, let's start here.
I think just that connection, right? Mm-hmm. Creating those loving experiences. So teaching them that they matter and that they make a difference. And if they can just learn to, have those moments with their child, eye contact, touch, that can make a difference. Teaching them a little bit about why that matters. And I think, and this is maybe a little bit of a sidebar conversation, but technology, I think parents are relying on technology to soothe their baby. So trying just to help them understand that babies need to learn to co-regulate, to self-regulate without that technology, because that is definitely causing a challenge.
So the connection piece. One thing that it made me think about, Tracy, when I visited your center a year ago was your morning meetings and what your educators share with their 3 to 5 year olds. What do they share with them every morning?
Every morning, along with fostering connections and building relationships, they had a morning meeting on their large group rug, and they had 3 things they had to talk about. And the first thing was always what they're doing well. And so something they had been learning, even if it was just learning how to do hallway expectations. So the first thing was always, what are we doing well? And the next thing is, what are we going to learn? And then the third thing is there any change to the day? So making sure they always knew if there was a change to the routine. But that was a consistency of each morning message.
Yeah, so even for children at home, right, this is a great tip. What are you doing well? What are we going to do today? What's the focus of today? And is anything going to be a little bit different? Right? Are we having a different child care provider? Is somebody coming over to look at our plumbing? And there's going to be some strange person coming to the side door that we are going to invite in. Maybe hearing something outside in the neighborhood. So knowing what to expect, I think, is really, really important. So that predictability.
Angie, you talked about connection and how important that was for parents and connection with their kids and young folks. But I think some of the feedback we heard, Tracy, from your staff too, was the connection for teachers to each other. It can feel very isolating at times for a teacher to be in your classroom, especially if you're dealing with really challenging behavior. And I think when we just started to do some initial presentations at the center around stress and how it impacts learning and how it's an issue with the nervous system, both for adults and for students, one of your staff had come up after the presentation and said, I'm so glad we're doing this together. This was me as a kid. I had some alcoholism, I had some mental health in the family, and it just set my life on a totally different course. So to understand that this might be what some of our kids are going through and how to intervene, how to act with that information was so helpful. And she, your staff had like tears in her eyes when she came up and said that. So I think just the simple awareness of, stress and trauma and how it affects our bodies and how it affects our behavior as adults and how it affects children was really helpful for the staff too.
Right. Mm-hmm. So let's say a child doesn't have access to really good quality early childhood care. What might we see or what can we do? I guess the question is, if there's no access to good quality early childhood care, what happens when that child enters K through 5, then K through 12 settings?
I think one thing that we talked a lot about at the Early Childhood Center, but we also talk about through all of our schools that are engaging in these conversations in St. Clair County all the way through high school, is just being aware of how adverse events, so abuse in the home, mental health symptoms in the home, parental incarceration, all these really difficult life events, what we call adverse childhood experiences, how it actually shifts and shapes the brain starting birth to 5. In that kids that have 4 or more of these adverse events, really according to the Michigan ACEs initiatives that really kind of looks at that funding or that looks at that social issue and what we do about it, those kids are 32 times more likely to have behavioral and learning problems, let alone be at more risk for 7 of the 10 leading causes of death socially, things like cancer, suicide, depression. So there's significant risk in not acknowledging that, and what can we do about it, and how can we buffer against some of those symptoms.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that anything that we can do, even if we are not a formal child caring professional. So anything we can do as a parent, a caregiver, a guardian to help foster connection and predictability and routine with children, maybe that are outside of a early childhood center would be important. And then just the whole idea that the brain is still rapidly developing during this time period. So even if that child is entering a system or entering, having an interaction with a parent or a caregiver or a professional at age 3, 4, 5, 6, you can still provide these new experiences and opportunities to continue to help reshape that brain framework. And are you seeing that earlier intervention is happening?
Yes, after we began to implement the things that we worked on with STAR, saw a decrease in the number of calls for assistance, the number of questions. Staff were, helping each other. We really had a decrease in that, and had staff members say that they're helping each other, or they feel more comfortable asking for help, or just those connections between the staff were increasing, just like for the students. So yes, we saw a great or a decrease in those referrals and those challenging behaviors.
Yeah.
Less elopement.
Less elopement, yeah. Less elopement, yeah. So the more we can help our adults, right, the more we can help our younger children. Jen, did you uncover any really opportunities for funding in this area? I know that can be a challenge for some child caring institutions and schools, organizations.
Yeah, funding was a challenge that I heard about, and I did not uncover any sort of mystical well of funding for this, unfortunately. The experts that I spoke with did mention that COVID relief funding played a role, but the childcare providers I spoke with, which were, in Detroit, from communities of color that are pretty typically disadvantaged, at least economically, they all said that relief money got chewed up immediately, just meeting the basic needs of keeping their doors open.
And protocol, right? Just protocol and safety.
Right, just buying the masks that they needed, trying to fix a window that had never opened properly to get the ventilation. So that funding didn't go far enough to reach mental health needs, which you might argue is a priority and should be the first thing, but they're just trying to keep their doors open. So the state did double from $1.5 million to $3 million the amount of money that's going into mental health consultation for these folks and other mental health supports. But at least some of the folks I spoke with said, that's wonderful and that's necessary, but it's simply not enough.
Wow. Hence the emergency. Hence the emergency that we're in for childhood and adolescent mental health. Oh gosh. Okay. So what can we think about in terms of moving forward, knowing that there's a national emergency, knowing that there's still stress in the world and life is still going to go on, knowing that we don't have access to enough funding? How can we instill hope, or how can we, as people who care about our children, move forward thinking to ourselves, I can still do something, right? There's still something I can do. We're not going to just throw our hands up and say it's a lost cause.
I mean, one thing that you mentioned about, being not necessarily the caregiver or the parent or guardian, but still playing a role in a kid's life, I would say maybe we could even expand that circle of adults who can be that positive presence in a kid's life, whether it's, a coach or even, the librarian. If a kid comes to the library every day, I think there's probably a lot of people in the community that can offer that consistent, engaging presence, even if they're not that child's parent or directly responsible for his or her well-being. So that's one thing I would say we all can sort of chip away at this a little bit.
Yeah, so, and what that makes me think of is you do not have to be a mental health professional to address the mental health emergency, right? As any caring adult who cares about kids and the well-being of our communities and future generations, that's a takeaway, right? Make connections with any child that you see. Yeah, what else do you feel hopeful for?
Kind of going back to your classroom or your question of, what do you think about when you enter the classroom or you first see some of these challenging behaviors? I think, as a social worker, there's a couple of things. One, we're extremely hopeful anytime we go into any classroom to do observations, see what's happening. And part of that reason is we look for, the fancy term is function, or what's driving, what's causing that behavior. And the reason we do that is we can identify that, whether it's stress or trauma, or students diagnosed with autism, or if we can kind of figure out what we think is driving that. We know what the interventions are. We know what good treatment looks like. And we've had a number of, preschool through high school kids affected by stress and trauma. And when we put targeted interventions in place that are, not traditional behavior modification, sticker charts and things like that, when they're actually aimed at the nervous system, gross motor activities, calming activities, when there's very specific interventions tied to the medical reason why we're seeing these symptoms, these kids get better. And it's so exciting, whether it's preschool or high school, to see them improve throughout the school year once they are receiving those very necessary medical interventions in a school setting.
And it's the need, right? It's like you said it perfectly. It's what's the function of the behavior? What's the need that's not being met? Is it safety? Is it routine? Is it predictability? Is it that they just don't know how to regulate? And once we can look at what's driving that symptom, we can provide them with what they need instead of punishing the behavior, right? So that is hopeful that you're seeing, like, wow, when we connect those two dots, the magic really begins to happen.
Well, and not only can we help, intervene for the students that need it, but then there's, several districts and centers like Tracy that are then taking that information and being very proactive with that. So we also have several school districts that are saying, how can I get this training to all of my staff at the beginning of the year? What are these trauma-informed steps? What do they look like? And they're being very creative in terms of funding and professional development, collaborating with local community mental health to develop social emotional programs that can be trained upon. We can increase awareness and then talk about some of the simple strategies we can do, whether it's for an individual student or the whole building or the whole district. So there's a number of different levels, if you will, that we could intervene on from the entire school district down to the individual student. So there's a lot to be hopeful for.
Yeah, and I mean, it strikes me, you as a social worker, your lens, and I'm just in listening to you, your lens is walking into the classroom and thinking what's right or what needs support rather than what's wrong. Right? You're not focusing just on the behavior, what's wrong, but what can we do to make a difference, right? So looking at either a system or a child through that lens, I think offers people hope. And I know that when we talk about trauma, we don't want to talk about trauma without talking about resilience or hope, because it's so important. It goes hand in hand. Those very experiences that we have that could be adverse can translate into very positive experiences if we know how to offer those too and change that neural framework. What are you seeing in terms of things that make you feel hopeful? Anything else in the early on space?
I guess one thing I can share that makes me feel really hopeful was as we implemented some of these things in the center, and we had staff members come and say that they were seeing their students help each other. They would bring the breathing card. You need to practice your breathing, or they would say, do you need to go to the calming corner? These were 3, 4, and 5-year-olds helping each other. But this same teacher was one that said, I'm starting to see it with the colleagues as well. Mm-hmm. So not even thinking about it, when we started implementing it, it was all for kids. We were doing this to do for kids. We weren't even thinking adult, but began to see those staff members foster connections and build relationships with each other, and no longer feeling like, oh, I need help, there's something wrong with me because my child is the one running out of the building. No, it was a connection and relationship between them. So that for me was a moment of like, there's a lot of hope on both the students and the staff.
Yeah, so it's contagious, right? As we're teaching, the educators are teaching one another. As we're teaching the students, they begin to teach one another. And that just has that exponential impact, yeah. Anything you want to add, Angie?
I think I feel hopeful because there is an awareness, right? There isn't an awareness that's out there. Tracy and I are actually presenting on Thursday to the early on service providers of St. Clair County. So we're going to be presenting on STARS, Trauma 0 to 5-year-old program. So we're looking forward to that. And I think if we can share some of the information that we know and teach those basic things of connection and understanding of brain development, that then people can share that, and hopefully, we can just keep expanding.
Yeah, and what it reminds me of is kind of where we started, Jen, with you. It's like, I think there's just not the awareness that this is impacting our youngest kids, right? So it's like, it's not just these teenagers that, we can see what the risky behaviors are, but it's like the kids are speaking to us through their challenging behaviors, and there's something we can do about it. So the awareness, I think, is just such a great place to start.
And taking it a step further, my hope is that a growing awareness will just help reduce the stigma even further. I think it's come a long way in terms of an adult population, right,
Yeah,
for mental health awareness. But as we start realizing and sharing that message that the whole population is affected, has mental health that needs to be nurtured and protected, my hope is that people will be willing and eager to come forward to get help, and that more help, of course, will be available.
Yes, and just the physical and the emotional connection, I think, is helped. Helping people understand that when we have stress and anxiety and depression, that impacts and that results in heart disease, in eating, disturbances, diabetes, all of the at-risk things that we do to try to calm ourselves that can cause more of a problem later on with drugs and alcohol. Yeah, there's so much. Well, let's take a look and see if our live audience has any questions for us. So we're going to transition over there to our studio audience. So in our studio, can you please raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask? Yes.
I'd like to hear a bit more about what was noted about using technology to soothe little ones and maybe the dangers of that, or what parents should be doing instead. Because I know as a parent I use technology sometimes to soothe, and I do see it a lot with others.
Yeah, so technology, and I know, Angie, you mentioned that at the beginning for your little ones, and I've got 2 teenagers, and we see that all the time. The phone is connected. So what are you seeing? What can we do about it? How is it impacting kids? Anything you want to share that you think might be helpful?
I think a lot of it is just kind of that awareness of technology, and I think we all get caught in it, right? You might be scrolling on your phone, and then all of a sudden you're feeling like irritable, or, you kind of like, sometimes for me, I might be scrolling the more I do it. So educating parents, but also just educating on the brain development. These kids are receiving so much stimulation through technology. So they're getting that, immediate gratification constantly. So then when they have to sit there and there isn't that technology and they just have their blocks that aren't giving that immediate gratification, what can they do? So I think just teaching the parents maybe about some different sensory strategies, giving their bodies that physical output, taking them to the park, playing outside, giving them massage, playing calming music, maybe some alternatives, and it might have to be, slowly decreased.
I was going to say time limited.
It does. I have a little guy that he is addicted to technology. So we're working with a family of just trying to help them understand how significant it is. He can't sleep at night. He can't be without his caregiver right by their side. So I think a lot of it is just education, how it's impacting the brain and how some of those neural connections aren't being formed. And so how can we help them learn new ways to calm their bodies and keep their bodies
So it just seems like such a heavy lift for parents. Like, so much of the answers are always like, well, parents need to do this, parents need to do that. I don't know how to get around it, but.
Well, and I think it's probably frustrating for parents too, because if that's the only way and they need to get in the shower, but then, they need to sleep, but it's almost like it's a vicious cycle. So I try to help them understand too, like, feel comfort, like, I get it and I know you need to do that, but let's try and build that time without, and hopefully then encourage them that there is hope that if their babies can learn to self-regulate, then they're not going to have as much of that need, and they're going to learn to entertain themselves and play with themselves as well as with their parent.
Yeah, and I know I've seen it's just parents who are using that method to self-soothe their own anxieties, right? So they may need to learn how to play, right? Maybe they have to kind of go back to the basics and learn how to play again, and what that looks like. So just practical things that you can share with parents to do with their children that may be simple, but they just haven't thought of them because it's very easy to hand over the tablet.
I think one of the things that's really simple too, and it's what's been so exciting doing this training with the early childhood centers. We often use a TED Talk from Dr. Dan Siegel, who's authored Brainstorm and is one of our national leaders on brain development. In that talk, he shares a study from Patricia Kuhl at the University of Washington where he looked at some of the early technology where exposing young learners to learning through video and replacing connection and one-on-one teaching with video, and they thought that would speed learning and memory. And what they found through the study was that it actually did the reverse. It made development, it slowed development, and it didn't lead to faster learning and development because we replaced that human connection with the technology. And it really was that human connection that speeds that growth in the brain. So I think the majority of parents want their kids to develop at a healthy pace and do well. So as we've been kind of sharing that video and that information, it's been a real aha moment for parents to say, gosh, I thought these videos and the tablet were really helping my son or daughter. Whereas the research is saying that's not necessarily the case. So, making sure we're aware of a balance of that and what that looks like. And it can be things as simple as putting your cell phone on the counter when you're watching TV with your son or daughter when you're interacting. So it can be really simple strategies once that awareness is built.
Yeah. Oh gosh, we could talk all day about technology, couldn't we? At every stage of life. Okay, I think we have another question. Another question?
I'd like to keep going on maybe the parent track here. How has communication evolved as as your programs have developed and you've learned more about trauma and resilience, all that? Where does communication with parents, how has that changed over the years?
How has it changed? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is back to where you started. It's just that I think there were generations that just did not know that early experiences impacted early childhood. I think it was the idea that they're too little to understand, they're too little to know. It's, they're just resilient, they're going to get over it. And I think the communication has changed now that it's the awareness of what we've learned over the last 25 years, which is exponential. We've learned so much. It used to be, don't pick up the baby when they're crying because then you're going to spoil them, to knowing that the more you react to what they need, the more they develop trust and the ability to regulate, right? So the communication, I think, is veering in a way that needs more education, but in a gentle way, not to say like, oh my gosh, you're so terrible that you don't know that this impacts an infant. It's kind of like, gosh, we've learned that maybe we didn't do things right before, right? So kind of in a gentle way, like, the more you know, the better you can do. I think communication has really helped that way. And just giving parents I've seen parents and educators the words to describe what's happening. So the words to describe what they're experiencing in those moments of stress, and the words to describe what they're seeing in their children in terms of behavior. Anything else stand out?
I think just kind of feeding off of what you said in that gentle way, empowering parents to let them know that they have everything they need. They have the skills, but really talking to them about that awareness and teaching them, but just empowering them to let them know, like, yeah, see how your baby's smiling at you. Mm-hmm. You're smiling back and you're giving them so much that they're going to learn from.
Right? They're the expert on their child. So we have strategies and tips that we can offer, and we can give do a little bit of education here and there, but they're doing the best they can because this is what they learned, right? So then how can we empower them to, I love that, just they have everything that they need. Yeah, help uncover it, yeah.
Was it one of your teachers, Lisa, too, that did a lot of co-regulation with the young kids, which is, you know, so the student would be hiding, leave class, screaming, yelling. And she shared these incredible stories of how she would sit with the student, she would use, you know, intentionally use a much lower voice, ask some slow paced questions. They would do some coloring, and then she would just watch the students at that kind of change and come back online, if you will. And then she's able to bring them right back into class, which is a very different kind of approach than, you know, get it together or else. You know, this is going to be the punishment, or you're going to go see Mrs. Blake if you don't get it together. So she's really just using her nervous system to help kind of bring this student's nervous system back online, and then back into class you go. So it's just a really powerful and quick, was it not?
It was, and it was always, she always looked at the interest. So even if the coloring picture, it was always like, for that child, whatever that child's interest was, that's what she had. Or if it was markers or crayons or whatever the case was. Yeah, and the more we did that, the more we used that strategy specifically with one student, realizing that's what it was that would help. This was an eloper. He stopped eloping, or the last few times he opened the door, he'd open the door and tiptoe out. You know, I mean, you could see the change, but he got to the point where he did tell us what he wanted to do.
And he knew his body felt good when Lisa did what she did. So he thought, maybe I'll stay. Maybe I'll stick around.
Also knew that adult was going to help me. My nervous system is like to a point where I need someone to guide me through this. So she stayed calm. She spoke slowly. Back in the class, and it was just a repetitive teaching cycle. If you need help, I'm going to guide you through this, and we'll figure it out. Versus if you don't get it together, you're going to go see the principal. You know, which can be appropriate at times, but is a very different approach. So I think that's really powerful to think about. How do we help really young kids co-regulate? You know, but us staying calm, we can help them be calm.
You know what Angie said? It's all inside you. It's like, yep, it's all about the nervous system, and your nervous system is inside you, and that's your tool. Your tool is your nervous system. So we have to regulate our own nervous systems to help regulate our children, and then it goes from there.
I really need to work on that. But I wanted to add one thing about this sort of communication piece. Some of the providers I spoke with were mentioning how the parents, that they might want to alert the parent to an issue that they're noticing in the classroom, but the parent almost doesn't want to hear it. They had to kind of overcome that willful ignorance because the parent is overwhelmed and doesn't kind of want that feedback. But another piece of that where I think people could have some help change that situation is that the parent also doesn't always know what to do with that information. And so something that they were mentioning to me was that they try to give parents the vocabulary that they might need to use when they call an insurance company, you know, or ask for an evaluation. The parent doesn't always know what words to use when they're trying to get help. So that was something that they thought providers could also.
When they go see their pediatrician, or a parent or caregiver may feel shame or guilt that maybe they're not doing the best job that they would like to do. And when somebody brings something to their attention, they feel like they have to be defensive because they feel bad about it. Yeah, so taking that away too, and just saying, you know, I know we all struggle with this. You know, you say you have a lot of work to do. We all, every day, all we do all day is try to keep our nervous systems regulated, right? And we do that in various ways, sometimes very, very healthy, and sometimes not so much, right? Yeah, I mean, we all go down that path. It looks like we have time for maybe one more question. Yes.
I'm curious, how can I as an individual support early childhood practitioners, but also how can I advocate for systems? What can I do to help? That's my question.
So how can we help individual practitioners, but how can we also help the system? Because we know that there's a lot of system challenge that we're up against here too. Do you have any ideas?
I mean, I think just kind of knowing there are some resources out there, right? Early on, community mental health, Great Start Readiness, your physician. So I think, you know, kind of helping parents have some of that language and maybe what to even ask for, what to seek out. So just maybe some more education on some of those resources that are available that might be able to help some of those daycare providers. You know, when you think, when you talk about that, I've been kind of thinking outside the box a little bit too. When we are able to go work with daycare providers, which is nice. And Tracy and I had talked about maybe doing some education. There's a daycare providers meeting in our county that one of our coworkers runs. So even just connecting with her. But I think just being aware that there are some resources if parents are really struggling. And so being able to help them know, talk to their pediatrician who then can sometimes do a funnel to get them to the right resource.
Well, I would say from an advocacy perspective, it might have sounded tangential before this conversation, but now I think we'll probably all be on board with the idea that the fact that caregivers and, childcare providers are so critical to these children's mental health, that we have to find ways to support their mental health. And I think one of the ways that we have to do that is by making sure they have a living wage and a thriving wage if possible. Yeah.
Well, and, just big thank you to you for highlighting this issue in your article. I mean, it's like here at Star, we saw the article and we're like, oh my gosh, she is understanding and uncovering what we know to be true, and trying to connect those dots and make people more aware that yes, these are the people that we need to take care of because they're taking care of our next generation. So important. Yeah.
I think too, making sure we ask for the perspective of our teachers and administrators. They're on the front lines. They're seeing this. Asking in terms of what more can we do? What kind of support do you need? Yale Schools in St. Clair County is phenomenal at doing short surveys with all of their students, preschool through 12th grade, and parents, teachers, administrators, and the data they got back that really started that district looking at trauma-informed practices. Because of those surveys, teachers and parents and students were seeing an uptick in mental health symptoms, depression, things like that. So bringing in some of the trauma-informed supports and social emotional learning tools that may help or benefit or improve that situation. I just thought that was a very wise way for that district to use survey data and the perspective of some very knowledgeable people, teachers and administrators and students, to say, what do you need? What are you seeing? What would be most helpful for you? And then that superintendent really acting on that data and bringing those supports in and kind of completing that feedback loop, if you will. So using those surveys and really trying to gauge the perspective.
Yes, so giving people a voice.
And that's a great way to give them a voice because they can fill out a survey. I'm not telling you face to face. I have the ability to write it down, to process it and think it through. We used that at the center a lot as we were moving through our process. I did monthly surveys just to kind of gather information. Where were people at? Kind of gauge, what they were feeling, what they were thinking, and what they needed next as we did our trainings, working through all of the early childhood information. It was very helpful.
Wow, that's great. Well, thank you so much. I would love to sit here and talk longer. You guys have just been great. Thank you so much for your unique perspectives. It's, I just love that we have such a interdisciplinary team, but also parents, right? And somebody who's affiliated with the Detroit Free Press, your occupational therapist, your teacher, your social worker, right? So we know that this is just, we've been saying as part of this Mental Health Matters series, it is truly going to take a village, right? It cannot just be one profession. It can't just be a teacher. It can't just be a parent. We all really have to come together to address this. And I just really appreciate that we've been able to highlight the importance of focusing on early childhood in this session. Also want to thank our sponsor, Sturgis Bank, and then of course our partner, Port Huron Area Schools in St. Clair RESA. And thank you for taking the time this morning to join this Mental Health Matters series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. We hope you can join us for our next discussion, and that's coming up next month in June. And thank you for participating.